Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked across the rocky landscape of Kepler-4 for to be through his helmet visor, and the red sun cast strange shadows on the purple rocks that covered most of the planet's surface, making everything look like an alien painting that his daughter Lisa might draw back home on Earth. And he smiled, thinking about her small hands holding crayons while she tried to color inside the lines of her coloring books, and how she always made the sky purple instead of blue because she said it looked more magical that way. And now here he was standing under an actual purple sky on a world that existed only in science fiction books when he was her age, growing up in small-town Ohio, where the biggest excitement was the annual corn festival and Friday night football games at the local high school where he met his wife, Karen, during their senior year when she was cheering for the home team and he was playing quarterback, throwing passes that usually ended up in the dirt because he was too nervous to concentrate, with her watching from the sidelines with her bright smile and encouraging waves that made his heart race faster than any opposing team ever could. And now, 20 years later, he was a lieutenant commander in the United Earth Space Force, leading a survey mission on an alien world that was supposed to be uninhabited, according to all their long-range scans and preliminary reports from the automated probe that had been studying this system for the past 3 years, sending back data that suggested this planet might be suitable for human colonization if they could find enough fresh water and minerals to support a permanent settlement. And so far the mission had been going exactly according to plan, with his team of 6 Marines collecting soil samples and atmospheric readings and geological surveys that would help scientists back on Earth determine whether this world could become humanity's second home among the stars. But something felt wrong today as Jake watched his team spread out across the valley floor below their landing site, near what appeared to be an ancient riverbed that had dried up millions of years ago, leaving behind smooth stones and mineral deposits that sparkled in the alien sunlight like scattered diamonds on a jeweler's table. And he had learned to trust his instincts during his 15 years of military service that had taken him from the training grounds of Mars to the outer colonies of the Jupiter system, where he had seen enough combat and danger to know when something was not right, even if he could not put his finger on exactly what was bothering him about this supposedly empty world that seemed too perfect and too quiet for a planet that should have been teeming with at least some form of primitive life. According to the atmospheric readings that showed oxygen and nitrogen levels that indicated biological processes had been at work here for thousands of years. And as he opened his mouth to call his team back to the shuttle for an early return to their ship, the ground beneath his feet began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that he felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. And suddenly, the purple sky above them filled with sleek metallic ships that seemed to appear out of nowhere like ghosts, materializing from another dimension. And Jake shouted into his communication system for his team to take cover and return fire as energy beams began raining down from the alien vessels with deadly precision that turned rocks into molten slag and sent his Marines scrambling for whatever protection they could find among the scattered boulders and dried creek beds that offered little shelter from an enemy that could attack from above with weapons that made human technology look like toys from a primitive civilization. And Jake could see his people were trapped in the open with nowhere to run and no way to reach their shuttle that sat burning on the hillside where one of the alien energy beams had found its mark and destroyed their only means of escape from this world that had suddenly become a death trap designed by an intelligence that had been watching and waiting for humans to arrive so they could spring their carefully planned ambush. And Jake made the only decision that a good commander could make in such a hopeless situation as he stood up from behind his cover and began running toward the center of the valley while firing his weapon at the alien ships and shouting for his team to fall back to the secondary extraction point that they had established during their initial landing procedures. And he could hear his people calling his name over the communication system, but he ignored their voices and kept running and shooting, even though his weapon had no effect on the alien ships that seemed to be made of some material that absorbed energy rather than reflecting it. And he could feel the heat from near misses as enemy fire tracked his movement across the rocky ground, but he kept moving and kept firing until something hit him from behind with a force that sent him flying through the air like a rag doll. And when he crashed into the ground, his vision went dark, and the last thing he heard was the sound of his team escaping in the distance while alien voices spoke in a language that sounded like music played backwards, and metal hands lifted his unconscious body from the purple dust of a world that would never become humanity's second home. Jake woke up in a room that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never seen colors before, and everything was various shades of gray and silver and white, with no warmth or personality anywhere to be found, and the walls seemed to curve in ways that hurt his eyes when he tried to focus on them, as if the geometry was wrong somehow, and not meant for human vision, and he could feel that his uniform had been replaced with a simple grey garment that felt like it was made from some kind of synthetic material that was neither warm nor cold but somehow managed to be both uncomfortable and practical at the same time, and when he tried to sit up he discovered that his hands and feet were secured to the metal surface he was lying on with restraints that looked more like liquid metal than actual chains or ropes, and they adjusted automatically to his movements, allowing him just enough freedom to be comfortable but not enough to escape or cause any damage to himself or his surroundings, and as his vision cleared he began to notice details about the room that made him realize he was no longer on the planet's surface but somewhere else, entirely because there were no windows and the air had a recycled quality that reminded him of being aboard a spacecraft or space station, and the gravity felt slightly lighter than Earth normal, which meant he was probably on a smaller world or artificial habitat. And then a section of the wall simply faded away like fog being blown by wind, and 3 figures entered the room, moving with a grace that seemed almost mechanical in its precision, and they were tall and thin with pale blue skin that had an almost translucent quality, and their eyes were completely black with no visible pupils or irises, just endless darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their faces showed no expression whatsoever, as if they had never learned how to smile or frown or show any kind of emotion, and their movements were so smooth and coordinated that Jake wondered if they were actually individuals or parts of some kind of collective consciousness that shared thoughts and decisions. And the one in front stepped closer to his restraint table, and when it spoke its voice had a musical quality that reminded him of wind chimes, but the words it used were perfectly clear English, which surprised him until he realized they must have some kind of translation technology that could convert their language into his, or perhaps they had been studying humans long enough to learn human languages. And the creature said that his name was Commander Vextar, and that Jake was now a prisoner of the Zephyrian Empire, and that he would be questioned about human military capabilities and the location of human colonies and other strategic information that would be useful in their expansion plans. And Jake tried to speak, but discovered that his throat was dry and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper when he asked why they had attacked his survey team and what they wanted from humanity. And Commander Vexter tilted his head in a way that might have been curiosity if he had been human, but on his alien features it looked more like a computer processing new data, and he explained that the Zephyrian Empire had been watching human expansion into space for several decades and had decided that humans represented a potential threat to their own territorial claims in this region of the galaxy, and that it would be more efficient to gather intelligence about human weaknesses and capabilities before launching a full-scale military campaign rather than engaging in a prolonged conflict that might prove costly in terms of resources and personnel. And Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that his capture was not just an unfortunate accident, but part of a larger plan to attack human colonies, and he wondered if his team had managed to escape, and warned the Earth Space Force about the alien threat. And Commander Vextar seemed to sense his thoughts, because he mentioned that Jake's companions had indeed escaped, but that their shuttle had been tracked and intercepted before it could reach their main ship, and that all 6 of his team members were now dead, which hit Jake like a physical blow to the chest, and he closed his eyes and tried not to think about the families back home, who would never see their loved ones again because of decisions he had made as their commanding officer. And when he opened his eyes again, he saw that one of the other aliens had approached his table and was holding some kind of device that looked like a metallic spider with thin legs that moved independently. And Commander Vextar explained that this was a neural probe that would allow them to access his memories and thoughts directly without the need for lengthy interrogation sessions, and that while the process might be uncomfortable, it was much more efficient than traditional questioning methods. And Jake tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was coming, but he had no idea how to defend against alien technology that could read minds, and he thought about Karen and Lisa back on Earth and hoped that whatever information these creatures extracted from his brain would not be enough to help them hurt the people he loved most in the universe. The neural probe felt like ice water being poured directly into Jake's brain, and he could sense the alien device trying to push through his thoughts and memories like someone rifling through filing cabinets in his mind. But something strange was happening, because instead of the overwhelming invasion he had expected, Jake found that he could somehow compartmentalize the intrusion and keep his most important memories locked away in places the probe could not reach. And he thought about the survival training he had received during his early military career when instructors had taught him meditation techniques and mental exercises designed to help soldiers resist interrogation and torture, and while he had never imagined using those skills against alien mind-reading technology, the basic principles seemed to be working as he focused on building mental walls around the information that could harm Earth and humanity, and Commander Vextar watched the readings on his monitoring equipment with what might have been confusion if Zephyrians were capable of such emotions, and after several minutes, he gestured for the technician to withdraw the neural probe, and Jake could see frustration in the alien's completely black eyes, even though his face remained as expressionless as a statue, and the commander announced that human neural architecture was more complex than they had anticipated, and that traditional extraction methods would need to be modified to account for the unusual way human consciousness seemed to organize and protect information, and Jake realized that his resistance was working better than he had hoped, and that these aliens had probably never encountered a species that could defend against their mental intrusion technology. And over the following days, the interrogation sessions continued with the Zephyrians trying different approaches and techniques, while Jake maintained his mental defenses and began to notice something interesting about his captors and their behavior patterns, and it started when one of the younger aliens, who Commander Vextar called Kethver, began showing signs of what Grick recognized as stress and fatigue, even though Zephyrians were supposed to be emotionally detached and logically focused according to everything Commander Vextar had told him about their species and their philosophy of pure rational thought. And Jake began to test a theory during his interrogation sessions by asking questions about Zephyrian culture and society and expressing genuine curiosity about their way of life and their history, and he noticed that his questions seemed to disturb his captors in ways they could not explain. And when Kethver mentioned that Zephyrians had evolved beyond the need for emotional responses, Jake asked him if he ever missed feeling happiness or sadness or love, and the young alien paused for a long moment before saying that such feelings were inefficient and served no logical purpose in an advanced civilization. But Jake could see something in Kethver's dark eyes that suggested he was not entirely convinced by his own words, and Jake began sharing stories about his life on Earth and his family and his experiences as a human being living in a world where emotions were not only accepted but celebrated as essential parts of what made life worth living. And he told them about the day Lisa was born, and how he had cried tears of joy when he first held her in his arms, and how Karen had laughed and called him a big softy, but her own eyes had been wet with tears of happiness. And he described the feeling of coming home after a long deployment and seeing his family waiting for him at the spaceport, and how Lisa would run to him with her arms outstretched, and how that moment of reunion made all the months of separation worthwhile. And he talked about simple pleasures like Sunday morning breakfasts when the three of them would make pancakes together, and Lisa would insist on flipping them herself, even though she usually ended up with more batter on the floor than in the pan, and how they would laugh and Karen would take pictures, and later they would look at those pictures and remember why family was the most important thing in the universe. And as Jake continued sharing these memories and experiences, he began to notice changes in his captors that were subtle at first, but became more obvious as time passed, and Kethver started asking questions about human emotions and relationships and what it felt like to love someone more than your own life. And Jake tried to explain concepts that he had always taken for granted, like compassion and empathy and sacrifice and forgiveness, and he could see that these ideas were having an effect on the young Zephyrian, who had begun to show signs of what humans would recognize as anxiety and depression and confusion about his own identity and purpose. And Commander Vextar noticed the changes in his subordinate and began to question Jake more aggressively about human psychological manipulation techniques and whether Jake was deliberately attempting to corrupt Zephyrian personnel with human emotional concepts. But Jake honestly explained that he was not trying to manipulate anyone, and that he was simply sharing his experiences as a human being because he believed that all intelligent life had the capacity for growth and understanding and connection, and that maybe the had lost something important when they chose to abandon their emotions in favor of pure logic and efficiency. Kethver stopped sleeping, and Jake could see the exhaustion in the young alien's movements as he shuffled into the interrogation room each day, looking more and more like someone who was fighting a war inside his own mind. And when Jake asked him if he was feeling alright, Kethver actually flinched, as if the question had physically hurt him, and he said that he had been experiencing strange sensations that he could not understand or categorize according to any Zephyrian scientific framework. And Jake realized that the alien was describing what humans would call guilt and emotional pain, and he tried to explain that these feelings were normal and natural responses to situations that challenged a person's moral framework, and that Keth was not broken or malfunctioning but simply discovering parts of himself that had been suppressed for so long that they felt alien and frightening. And the young Zephyrian looked at Jake with those dark eyes that seemed less empty than they had before and asked what it meant to forgive someone who had caused harm. And Jake told him about the time when he was 12 years old and his best friend, Danny, had accidentally broken his father's antique watch while they were playing in the garage, and how scared Danny had been to tell anyone what had happened, and how Jake had taken the blame instead, because he could see that his friend was genuinely sorry, and that sometimes protecting someone you cared about was more important than avoiding punishment. And Kethva listened to this story with an intensity that seemed to consume his entire being, and when Jake finished speaking, the alien said something that chilled Jake to the bone, because Kethva admitted that he had participated in the torture and execution of hundreds of prisoners from dozens of different species over his career, and that he had never questioned the morality of these actions until now, and that the guilt was like a poison spreading through his mind, making it impossible to function normally. And Jake felt his own heart breaking for this creature who was experiencing conscience for the first time in his life, and he told Kethva that feeling guilty about past actions was actually a sign of moral growth, and that the pain he was experiencing was his mind's way of telling him that he had the capacity to become a better person if he chose to change his behavior. And Commander Vexstar became increasingly agitated as he watched his staff deteriorating under the influence of Jake's humanity, and he implemented new protocols to limit contact between the human prisoner and Zephyrian personnel, but the damage had already been done because word of Kethva's condition had spread throughout the facility, and other aliens began approaching Jake with questions about emotions and relationships and moral responsibility. And Jake found himself in the strange position of being a counselor and teacher to the very people who had captured and tortured him, and he tried to help them understand concepts like empathy and compassion, and the difference between justice and revenge, and how love could make someone stronger rather than weaker. And each conversation seemed to trigger more emotional awakening among the Zephyrian staff, and Jake began to see tears in alien eyes that had never cried before, and he witnessed breakdowns and panic attacks and existential crises as beings who had lived their entire lives according to cold logic suddenly discovered that they had hearts and souls that had been locked away for generations. And the interrogation facility began to feel more like a psychiatric hospital than a military installation, as Zephyrians struggled to cope with feelings they had no framework for understanding or managing. And Commander Vexter made one final desperate attempt to break Jake's spirit by bringing him false evidence that his team had been captured alive and tortured to death, while calling his name and begging him to save them. And Jake felt the terrible weight of that possibility crushing down on him like a mountain, but instead of breaking, he looked directly into Commander Vextar's black eyes and said that even if that story were true, he would still choose to forgive the people responsible, because hatred and revenge would only create more suffering, and that the meaning of his sacrifice came from the choice to protect others rather than from the outcome of that choice. And Commander Vextar stared at him in complete silence for several minutes before asking how any rational being could maintain hope and compassion in the face of such loss and cruelty. And Jake explained that hope was not based on logic or probability, but on the fundamental belief that every intelligent being had the potential for good, and that even in the darkest circumstances, love and kindness could plant seeds that might grow into something beautiful and meaningful. And as he spoke these words, Jake could see something breaking inside Commander Vexter's mind, as if walls that had been built over centuries were finally crumbling under the weight of truths that could no longer be denied or ignored. The interrogation facility descended into chaos as more Zephyrians experienced what Jake could only describe as emotional awakening, and it was like watching people discover colors for the first time after living their entire lives in a world of gray shadows. And some of them handled the transition better than others, but many were completely overwhelmed by feelings they had no ability to process or understand. And Jake found himself spending more time counseling his former captors than being questioned by them, and Kethva had become his most devoted student and follower, asking endless questions about human emotions and relationships, and begging Jake to help him understand the guilt and remorse that were eating away at his sanity like acid. And Jake tried to explain that healing from past mistakes required acceptance and forgiveness of oneself, as well as a commitment to making different choices in the future, and that the pain Kethva was feeling was actually a sign that his conscience was working properly, and that he still had the capacity to become the person he wanted to be rather than remaining trapped by the person he had been. And other Zephyrians began approaching Jake with their own emotional crises, and he listened to confessions about atrocities committed in the name of logic and efficiency, and he offered what comfort and guidance he could, while trying to help them understand that acknowledging past wrongs was the first step toward redemption and change. And some of the aliens became catatonic from the overwhelming weight of guilt and responsibility they felt for their species' history of conquest and cruelty, while others became fiercely protective of Jake, seeing him as the source of their newfound ability to feel genuine emotions and experience authentic relationships with other beings. And the command structure began to break down as Zephyrians questioned orders and refused to participate in activities that they now recognized as morally wrong, and Jake watched in amazement as beings who had been raised from birth to value logic above all else began making decisions based on compassion and empathy and love. And Commander Vexstar tried desperately to maintain control of the situation by isolating Jake from the rest of the facility staff, but his own subordinates began to refuse his orders, and some of them actually stood between Jake and the commander when Vexstar threatened to terminate the human prisoner rather than allow him to continue corrupting Zephyrian personnel. And Jake realized that he had become the center of a revolution that was spreading throughout the facility like wildfire, and he felt both honored and terrified by the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders, because these beings were looking to him for guidance about how to live as emotional creatures in a society that had been built on the complete rejection of everything that made life meaningful and beautiful. And he tried to teach them about forgiveness and second chances, and the difference between justice and revenge, and how to build relationships based on trust and mutual respect rather than fear and dominance. And he shared stories about human history and how his own species had struggled with many of the same moral questions and ethical dilemmas, and had slowly learned to choose cooperation over competition and love over hatred, even though the process had taken thousands of years and was still ongoing. And he told them about the mistakes humanity had made and the lessons they had learned, and how every generation had the opportunity to do better than the one that came before. And as the days passed, Jake began to see genuine friendships forming between Zephyrians who had never experienced emotional connection with other beings, and he watched former torturers learning to comfort victims of their past actions, and he saw enemies becoming allies as they discovered that they shared common hopes and dreams and fears and vulnerabilities. And the facility that had been designed as a place of suffering and extraction became something entirely different as Zephyrians began decorating the gray walls with colorful artwork and plants and personal items that reflected their newly discovered individuality and creativity. And they started sharing meals together and telling stories about their lives and their families and their dreams for the future. And Jake felt privileged to witness this transformation, even though he knew that his own rescue was probably impossible given the chaos that surrounded them and the fact that Earth's Space Force had no idea where he was being held, or even if he was still alive. But somehow that did not matter as much as it should have, because he had found purpose in helping these beings discover their own humanity. And he realized that sometimes the most important battles were not fought with weapons or technology, but with kindness and understanding, and the simple willingness to see the potential for good in every living creature, regardless of their past actions or current circumstances. 3 weeks after the facility had transformed into something resembling a therapeutic community rather than a military installation, Jake was teaching a group of former interrogators about the concept of friendship when alarms began sounding throughout the complex, and Kethva rushed into the room with panic in his newly expressive eyes, announcing that human ships had been detected approaching the moon base and that Commander Vexter was preparing to activate the facility's self-destruct system rather than allow Earth forces to discover what had happened to their missing officer. And Jake felt his heart racing as he realized that rescue was finally within reach, but that it might come at the cost of all the progress and transformation he had witnessed among the Zephyrians, who had become more than just his captors and were now his friends and students, and in some ways his family. And he stood up quickly and told Kethva to gather as many of the reformed Zephyrians as possible and meet him at the central control room, where they would have to convince Commander Vexter that surrender was a better option than destruction. And as they moved through the corridors, Jake could see the fear and confusion on alien faces that had learned to show emotion, and he tried to project calm and confidence, even though he was terrified that everything they had accomplished together would be lost in a moment of violence and desperation. And when they reached the control room, they found Commander Vexstar standing before a bank of monitors showing the approaching human fleet led by the battleship U.S. Defiance under the command of Captain Pete Williams, who Jake recognized as an old friend from their academy days. and Jake stepped forward slowly with his hands visible and spoke directly to Commander Vexstar, explaining that the approaching humans were not invaders but rescuers, and that this was an opportunity to establish first contact between their species, on terms of mutual respect and understanding rather than conquest and fear. And Commander Vexstar looked at Jake with eyes that showed more emotion than Jake had ever seen in any Zephyrian face, and the alien leader admitted that he no longer understood his own thoughts and feelings, and that the certainty he had once possessed about the righteousness of Zephyrian superiority had been shattered by weeks of exposure to human compassion and moral reasoning. And Jake placed his hand gently on Commander Vexstar's shoulder and told him that uncertainty was not weakness but wisdom, and that the ability to question one's beliefs and change one's mind was actually a sign of intelligence and strength, and that this moment could be the beginning of something better than either species had ever imagined. And Kethver stepped forward and announced that he and many other Zephyrians wanted to surrender peacefully and request asylum with the human forces because they could no longer participate in their empire's policies of conquest and oppression. And Jake felt tears running down his cheeks as he realized that his influence had spread far beyond anything he had hoped for, and that these beings were willing to risk everything to embrace the emotional awakening he had accidentally triggered. And when Captain Pete Williams contacted the facility, demanding Jake's immediate release, Kethver was the one who responded, explaining that the prisoner was safe and that the Zephyrians wished to negotiate a peaceful resolution and exchange of information. And over the following hours, Jake found himself serving as translator and mediator between two species that had never imagined they could coexist peacefully, and he watched in amazement as former enemies began discussing trade agreements and cultural exchanges and joint scientific expeditions, and the possibility of establishing diplomatic relations that could benefit both civilizations. And when the rescue team finally arrived, they found Jake surrounded by Zephyrians who seemed more concerned about his welfare than their own safety, and Captain Williams later told him that it was the strangest rescue operation he had ever participated in, because instead of extracting a prisoner from hostile territory, they had ended up facilitating the first interspecies peace conference in human history. And Jake returned to Earth as a hero and was reunited with Karen and Lisa, who had feared they would never see him again. And he tried to explain what had happened during his captivity, but found that words were inadequate to describe the transformation he had witnessed, and the friendships he had formed with beings who had once been his enemies. And over the months that followed, Jake maintained regular communication with Kethver and other reformed Zephyrians who were working to change their society from within and establish new policies based on cooperation rather than conquest. And the former interrogation, the facility was converted into a cultural exchange center where humans and Zephyrians could meet and learn from each other. And Jake often visited to share his experiences and continue teaching about human values and emotions. And during one of these visits, Commander Vexstar approached him privately and said that he had been undergoing therapy with human psychologists and was slowly learning to process the guilt and remorse he felt about his past actions, and that he wanted to thank Jake for showing him that redemption was possible even for someone who had caused so much suffering. And Jake looked into the alien's eyes that now showed genuine emotion and told him that everyone deserved a second chance, and that the measure of a person's worth was not their past mistakes, but their willingness to learn and grow and change. And as Drake prepared to leave the facility for the final time before retiring from active duty, he realized that his greatest victory had not been surviving torture or escaping captivity, but proving that kindness and compassion could triumph over hatred and fear, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the universe was simply the willingness to treat others with dignity and respect regardless of their species or their history.